It is my pleasure to kick off this evening, and doing so, I'm going to introduce you to Paul Franson, who is an old friend of Mr. James Conaway. I have had the pleasure of spending a few different conferences talking to Jim, so I call him Jim now, and is that okay? Okay, all right, because I'm not writing this on the cover of a book. And Paul is going to have a conversation with Jim. Jim's going to talk with you, and we're all going to talk together, hopefully one at a time. Paul Franson has lived in Napa Valley since 1996. You may have read some of his articles in Wines and Vine, Wine Business Monthly, Senior Connection, and the Napa Valley Register. He's also written for the Wine Enthusiast, Food and Wine, Decanter, the Chronicle, and other publications. Sounds like you travel a lot, too. He writes about life, food, and travel in his weekly Napa Life newsletter, which I have to say I really do enjoy reading. The Napa Valley Register and other publications. He formerly ran a PR agency in Silicon Valley, and boy, let's get rid of that corporate thing, right? And then became a magazine writer and editor. He's published 3 books on marketing and 1 on the Napa Valley. And this is where you're going to have to someday tell me about your home gardening, cooking, and former winemaker, Paul Franson.
Actually, I will take care of the home winemaking quickly. I was a home winemaker for 30 years until I moved to Napa, and then I stopped because everybody else made better wine than I did. But I made it. The first wine was in Dallas, Texas, where I made wine from the Thompson seedless and the Concord grape by property. And I used baker's yeast, and it was not exactly great. But we're not here to talk about that. I've known Jim Conaway for longer than I really remember, and it's weird how I met him. I actually insulted him in print, and he called me up and pointed out that I was wrong about something. And what I was wrong about was I had referred to his book, Napa, as a novelization. And he pointed out it was not a novelization, it's all true. It just happened to be as readable as a novel. So that's where I first met him. But he started out writing about wine in sort of a funny way, as I understand it. He was actually a real honest-to-goodness journalist working for the Washington Post, and they asked him to write a wine column, right? And so he started writing about wine, and that led to an interest in wine, and then he visited Napa Valley, and that developed from there. Now, he started in Memphis, as you'll hear in a moment, and so he didn't have much wine probably when he was growing up in Memphis.
Just Thunderbird.
Oh, come on. You want? I don't know if we need these things, but we have to for recording, yeah.
Thanks, Paul.
Actually, I just realized I forgot, though. I was supposed to introduce a little bit more. You all probably know his book, Napa, which was the one that he wrote in 1990, was it?
Yes.
And it's about Napa Valley, and it was very well received as a book. I think the definitive book about Napa Valley, not as well received by a few people in Napa Valley who felt that he wrote about things that he shouldn't have written about. But they bragged to him about what they were doing and what they expect when you talk that way to a journalist. And he followed up with another book looking at sort of the dark side of Napa called The Far Side of Eden about 12 years later, 14.
Yes, it was 12. It was 11 years later.
11 years later. And so he wrote these 2 very important nonfiction pieces about Napa Valley and why it is the way it is and the forces going on. And then he took a break. And now his latest book is a novel. It's not based in Napa Valley, he says. And it's not about anybody that you would recognize or any places that you would recognize. So, Jim, why don't you tell us more about how you came to write this?
Okay, I will. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Christine. Thank you to Ramsgate. What a gorgeous view. Look at that. You guys are looking this way, but that view is unbelievable. It's great to be here. Having written nonfiction about Napa Valley and the related culture for a long time, some people say too long, I had this idea for a book about the same culture that wasn't hampered by almighty fact. Some people say my other books are not hampered by almighty fact, but they were really. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice to let your imagination, my imagination, go and see where it went? And one of the things I'd been thinking about was I was a wine critic for a time for the Washington Post, but I was mostly a fraud. I was writing profiles, cultural and political profiles for the style section back when they did long pieces. And I lived in Europe. My wife and I lived in Europe for 4 years before that. And the wine critic at the Post quit. And I said, well, why don't you let me do it? You'll find somebody who's qualified, and then I'll just step back. Well, they never found anybody as qualified. So I had to figure out, at that point, I had to actually learn something about wine. And one of the things I did, besides what we all do when we're trying to learn about wine, which is to go to tastings and read and drink, I came out here. And Napa Valley and Sonoma, there's a lot, I see a definite connection between the two. It was a true subculture at a time when everybody's talking about this is a subculture, that's a subculture. Well, often they aren't, but this really is. And I thought people read in the newspaper, they read, pruning shears and wind machines and smudge pots. Everybody knows what those are. Well, they don't know what those are in Washington. They don't know what those are in Memphis, where I come from. And so I thought I needed some encouragement from my editor because I had written some other books. And I said, I don't want to write a book about wine, but I'd like to write a book of sociological history. That sounds like that's a little bit too highfalutin. Essentially, I said I'd like to write a nonfiction book of reportage about a really unique place, which is wine country north of the Bay. And I thought about this later. Neither my editor nor I could understand why this hadn't already been done, because people, in America, books are written about everything imaginable, particularly if it's worth a book, there'll be several. There were none. And I think the reason for that was that wine writers, for the most part, are not interested in doing long research into the families and all that, the background and all that, and taking notes for a year, 2 years and then writing a book. That isn't the way they function. And reporters who are able to do that and accustomed to doing it are intimidated by the subject, because although I wasn't really an expert on wine, I knew more than most people. And you need to know something about wine to write about Napa Valley the way I did in that book. So anyway, that's how that came about. And if I can talk more about that later if you'd like me to.
Can I interrupt just a second? Another thing that Jim did was he's a reporter, he's a journalist. And people call me a wine writer. I'm not a wine writer. I'm a writer, and I write about wine. A wine writer to most people is somebody who rates and reviews wines. And these people want to stay on the good side of the wineries for many reasons. And so the wine people in Napa Valley were not used to journalists. They're used to wine writers who come up there and they want, free dinners, free wine, stay in the guest house, hobnob, hang around with the people, be important. And there are a few who are not like that. But generally, that is what most wine writers are looking for. They're not about to be very objective and critical about what they find.
Yeah, that's true. And, of course, I didn't realize, I was a bit naive. I didn't realize what a reaction that first book, Napa, was going to have. Because Paul's already heard this story before. But I went around, everywhere I went, I took a big spiral notebook. And they're still in my basement in Washington. And I wrote down almost everything anybody said, the old-fashioned sort of journalism, sitting there with a pen writing. So it's not as though, well, there was one case where I did it surreptitiously, but all the other times I did it. That's because I wanted to be able to not to get kicked out of this particular event. I could also tell you about that, but. Anyway, I was surprised at the reaction that came when that book was published. And I'm from the South, and actually Paul's from the South, too. We're both Southerners out here.
I don't sound like it.
But he is. We're both reverse carpetbaggers. This is going to sound crazy, but Sonoma and Napa actually had something when I was here in the late 80s, it reminded me of the South. I grew up in Memphis, and you had the same situation of these landed agricultural families, been here a long time, did things the way they wanted them done. You were either believed in the cause, which, in the South it's exceptionalism and sort of secession, or here you believe in wine and whatever it takes to sell the stuff. And then if you don't, you're an apostate, and there's nothing in between. So that reminded me of it. Then they had these Napa. They had these great biblical these fights out of Faulkner. Brothers fighting in the vineyard. It sounded like Absalom people. And people, or Genesis maybe, I don't know. And but there was also a great side to it. People helped each other. It's true. The same is true in Napa, in Sonoma. And I remember Louis Martini talking about how great Sonoma was. They still have that vineyard that's on the west side of the Miacamas. So anyway, I thought, well, it's probably the same thing. Since I was critical, sort of showed things the way they are. People resented that. And any rate, to get back to my novel, I had this vision at some point about, I used to write fiction in the beginning. I was a Stegner Fellow at Stanford, and that's how I got started. Then I had to earn a living, so I ended up going into journalism as Paul knows, it's sort of we realize now was the golden age of journalism, which was the 80s and late 70s and 80s. And anyway, I had this idea. What would it be like if you really had an extraordinary nose, where you could? I mean, there are people like that. Parker's one person. There are others. I mean, there are many who have it, and it's a physiological thing. You have more, nerve endings on your palate and all these other things that you need. And what would that be like if you could really, smell a broomstick when you came into somebody's house? I mean, it was and if you had this talent in your whole existence and you'd gotten rich on it, as this character Clyde Craven-Jones is his name in Nose, what would that be like for people, your spouse, for instance? And what would it be? What would your daily routine be like? And what would your real passion be? Would you really be passionate about things most people are passionate about, like sex, or would you be passionate about just wine and nothing else would really matter? So all this stuff's working away in the old subcontinent. And I was staying with some friends on the east side of Napa who were not in wine. They're actually journalists, and they have a little guest house. I woke up one morning, and I was sitting there thinking about it, drinking tea and I thought, and all of a sudden, this character just sort of came kicking out like a 300-pound baby out of my head. And I started writing on my computer, and I wrote the entire first chapter that morning. And I thought, and I read it over, and I was laughing. I thought, this is pretty funny. I don't know what people are going to think about this, but so I pushed on. Long story short, it kept going. And I couldn't sell the book in truncated form. I'd show some of it. Nobody would pay for it. Then I'd show some more. So finally, I just said, you have to make a decision, and I finished it. And I'm glad I did, because then it worked, and it sort of all came together. And poor Clyde Craven-Jones gets into trouble at the end of the novel. This novel has been criticized in the press locally for being salacious, at least the first paragraph, and also for being 102 words long. So I don't know. I think it's the right 102 words, and I'll let you judge about whether or not it's salacious.
Well, I'm sure some of you have read the book, so we won't say anything that'll destroy the rest of it for you. It's very entertaining. It doesn't take a long time to read. But one of the things that everybody I run into who's read the book says, who do you think so-and-so is? And that's the big thing. They say they can identify this person maybe, or that person, or the place, and I certainly can identify some of them. But how do you get your inspiration?
Well, inspiration for novelists is usually where you really just have a real antipathy to some person or a couple of people, and the best way to build a really nasty villain is to wrap 3 actual people up into one character. That's all I'm going to say on that.
I think I can guess who some of them are.
And for there's an environment. My favorite character in the book. Well, actually, I'm very partial to big old Clyde Craven-Jones, because even though he's preposterous and pompous, he has talent and he has integrity. So he actually believes what he's doing matters, and he's kind of incorruptible in that sense as a wine critic. That's really kind of special. So I like him. But there's another character in the book named Cotton Harrell, nicknamed Calamity Harrell. He's an environmentalist. He's a biodynamic farmer. He's a river biologist, and he runs afoul of the classic lifestyle vintner, whose name is Jerome Hutt. He's one of these people who, we see this not just here, all over the United States, people who develop sort of defenseless pieces of pathetic real estate from far off places, make millions of dollars, and then split and build paradise, And there's something wrong with that concept, to my mind, morally and otherwise. And so anyway, this vintner happens to live next to Cotton Harrell. And luckily for Cotton Harrell, he's upwind of Jerome Hutt's winery. And his winery is called Copernicus. It's on this. It's one of those manufactured ridiculous names that people go to scientists or to the heavens or whatever. And actually, when they did the cover of this book, the designer of St. Martin's Press is really quite good. But they just had the cover without any cork or anything. It looked like, if you saw this out of cork, I said, people are going to think this is about nasal surgery. It even has blood all over. You need a cork on there. So then they, being New Yorkers, they put a little short white cork, that you'd pull out of a Chianti Fiasco or something. I said, no, you need a long, ugly yellow cork with one end red. So then to their credit, they actually listened to me. And I think it made a difference. I don't know how I got on that, but. Anyway, did I answer your question?
No. Well, actually, one of the reviews I read about the book referred to the Clyde Craven-Jones as the hero, but maybe I'm wrong, but I think the hero is a former journalist who is doing good works, and so I wondered if how that happened to be.
Well, actually, he is. He's sort of the anti-hero. But he and I have something in common. His name is Les Breeden, and he's slightly alcoholic. That's not what we have in common. But he's slightly alcoholic, and he comes to work for a newspaper, much like one you might find in Santa Rosa or Napa or any nice town in Northern California, and he gets fired because of the recession. The novel is set in the Bush recession, and so he first tries being a private detective. That he fails at that, and then he decides to be a wine critic, which is pretty funny. And he becomes a blogger, and he becomes a success not because he knows anything about wine, but because he's an incendiary. He writes incendiary political stuff and gets all involved in Jerome Hutt's big development plans, essentially.
That sounds familiar to me.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of antecedents to that. So anyway, I have a soft spot for him because I became a wine critic without knowing much about wine, and in journalism, and also I was sort of I'm interested and saddened by what's happened to journalism in this country and the dearth of places, that actually now go out and cover stuff and that people actually read about what goes on. I wish blogs would fill that space, but they don't, I don't think.
Well, one of the things that I am always curious about is why you picked Napa versus Sonoma or somewhere else. Or, there's a wine country near where you live now in Washington, It's just
There
getting
is, there is. Actually, there is. It's the oldest, way older than your wine country, Paul. But it's the Thomas Jefferson failed spectacularly in the 18th century, and Virginia's just recovering, but it's never going to compete with that. I mean, that's why Napa? Because Napa was the most obvious, the most celebrity. It was a celebrity location. But Napa and Sonoma are, and it's sort of, the reason is related. Sonoma, to my mind, and I don't know Sonoma nearly as well as I know Napa, is you still have real agriculture here. It's not, you have, there are other things which I think is valuable. You've got, orchards, cattle, whatever. And it's bigger. And Napa is so tight. It's all these people shoehorned in there with a lot of brains and talent and money, and there's bound to be sparks that fly off. And people often ask, why? What's the point of, what brings this to the fore? But you look at, there are two ways of looking at Napa and Sonoma, actually. Sort of the spine of the Mayacamas is a good way to look at it, and Sonoma shares a lot of this. There, in one sense, the most least charitable way to look at it is they're big hot tubs full of little naked Jay Gatsbys who are all trying to stand up and be noticed. So that's one extreme view of it. The other extreme view is what is the Napa and Sonoma valleys in the 200 years ago, when grizzlies were catching steelhead down on the flats and the valleys, and when up on the Mayacamas range, it took a raindrop a week to get to the earth. So thick was the canopy of redwoods and other trees that came down. This was the southern tip, really, of the temperate rainforest that starts way up in southeast Alaska, and the death of that's one of the real tragedies, I think, of the climate situation today. So if you have those two things, then what is the tension between those two? That's not a lot of time, 150 years, 170 years, and wine is the reason. And wine in Napa Valley happened faster. It's an accelerant. It makes the money quickly. It can accelerate one's social position. It's a great way to gently, effectively, culturally wash money that's made in less salubrious ways. It's the great American story, and it's all compressed. It's an accordion. It's so quick. This landscape we're looking at, I can remember even when first time I saw it. It's different. It's changed so much in such a short period of time. And anyway, that's the reason.
Well, one of the themes in all of your books that I'm aware of, at least the recent ones, novels and non-novels, is the effect of nouveau riche coming into Napa Valley, and other wine areas, Santa Barbara, wherever you want to be, Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. But do you think these wealthy newcomers who are trying to stand up the hot tub almost, are worse than the corporate?
No, I don't. There, some of them are corporate, but not the. You mean you're talking about the big multinationals? No, I think the corporations are infinitely worse, because these the people I'm talking about, and granted, this is a reduction. It's not fair. You can't say that about even people who've made money in real estate elsewhere. They're all go into this category, but to my mind, the corporations are a real threat, because they love it the way it is now. But if wine ever has a serious downturn or something happens, I think individuals are more likely to, in part because of community pressure, to stand against the changing of what, for instance, very sensible laws, zoning laws, agricultural preserve, all that stuff that are really valuable and really helped maintain the look of the place as they have. And corporations are not, they might be interested in it today, but corporations are about something else entirely, particularly big ones. And community interest is very low on the list. If in fact it's not really there when push comes to shove. So.
Well, it's interesting that most of the big wine companies are actually owned by families, are very tightly held groups. The exceptions, of course, are Constellation. Diageo is one. Diageo sold the land and wineries that they have in Napa Valley in a financial transaction, so they don't actually own anything now. They own the brands. And it seems so bizarre to me if you would talk to Piero Antinori or somebody, Robert Scali from Europe, the idea of selling the land and keeping the brand is so bizarre. But it seems like those people have very little stake in Napa Valley, obviously.
No, they and frankly, I don't really understand how that. If they own the brand, how can they dictate what happens to the wines in these particular brands?
They make the wines and all. What they don't own is the real estate, and but it's interesting. 1,000 acres, basically, that was put into a financial trust for because the big companies want to reduce the assets on their balance sheet, of course, so they have higher profit, higher return on assets. And Constellation has done a lot of that. They've sold off a lot of land too.
Well, I should know this, but who, if the owners of the land decide to go in another direction, can they do so?
Well, they're tied to the contracts for a certain period of time, and there may be a buyback at the end, which may require them to do it. Yeah. But it's still very strange to me that one of the largest landowners in Napa Valley, doesn't own any land. I mean, largest wineries that has all this land.
Well, that's not the first example of branding sort of screwing up a situation that worked pretty well beforehand. The point is they still have tremendous influence on what happens, and the political system is going to respond to that.
But it is true that Constellation makes most of their money now off beer. They import Corona, and they also have growing spirits, and Diageo makes most of their money off liquor. And you make so much more money on beer and spirits than you do on wine. You really wonder why are they in it? And yet Gallo is getting into spirits, obviously. Trinchero is getting into spirits because they see the opportunity and the money that can be made there.
Well, what do you think is so what does this mean downstream then for a place like Napa, places like Napa or Sonoma where there is a big corporate presence, even if they don't own all the land now?
Well, the good news is that something like 90% of all the wineries in Napa Valley are owned by families. However, some of those that are not owned by families are very large. But the largest winery in Napa Valley is probably Trinchero now, I'm sure. And they're like the sixth largest, they make Sutter Home and all. And they're very benign people. The Gallos are a family. Kendall Jackson, Jackson family is a family. The Delicatos, Fred Francia, who's sort of outrageous, but at Bronco, it's his family. The wine group is a little bit more broadly held, but it's also a family. But they have a very big stake in keeping Napa Valley. Last week, Constellation held a big party to celebrate Robert Mondavi's 100th birthday. And I asked Tim Mondavi at the wine auction, are they honoring your dad or are they exploiting him? And Tim said, But he and his brothers, Michael and his sister, Marcy, did not come to that function, which was filled with more suits than I've ever seen in Napa Valley. But the president of Constellation got up there, Rob Sands, and said, this is very, very important to us, and it's very important to maintain this. So he really knows the value of the Mondavi name, and I think they really have treated it very well. They haven't dramatically expanded production. They've kept the quality up. They've actually invested more in some ways in that brand. So I think in this case they realize they've got something good and they're going to take care of it. I'm not sure that all corporations feel that way, though.
But they still own the land, or they don't own the land?
They own the land now.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
But they have sold other land in other parts of California. But they definitely have kept the land they have in Napa Valley. And they also own Franciscan, which is another high-end winery. And they have other very good properties all. But unlike when the Hubelines and the United Vintners and the other people like that in the past came in, most of the people who were buying wineries now are trying to move them up. They're not doing what I think it was Hubline who did to Inglenook, which is to turn it from the most respected name in California into garbage. And finally, Francis Ford Coppola bought it back, and he claims he paid more for the name than he did when he bought his land there.
Yeah, well, Coppola has not been you know, it's complicated what he did. You could say that he did plenty of damage in his own way to the place, although that may have changed.
Of course, his big business now is up in Sonoma County. In Geyserville, he has a very, very, very successful winery where they make a lot of wine, over 1 million cases a year. And Inglenook is still a very small part of it.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me, going back to the Mondavis, that's got to be one of the great Napa's great success stories. Maybe it's the biggest, but to my mind, it's also the biggest failure, or one of them. I mean, the fact that family name, that family operation went down. It's hard to say that if it sold for $1 billion that it went down, but it's not theirs anymore, and that whole sort of ethos that grew out of what Bob Mondavi was doing is, in the end, it turned out to just be a kind of marketing ploy. That's the way it looks to everybody anyway. And I think there's something to that.
That's true, and I think now we should probably let some of you ask some questions. We've been talking enough. You got to ask some questions, or we'll be very embarrassed.
We've already answered.
I just want to say, although the Robert Mondavi situation happened, I have to say that Continuum is such an amazing, beautiful project that came out of the ashes, and it would never have happened if it wasn't for everything that happened. And so Tim and his kid, and the legacy will go on and on, and I'm just so happy about how that came out of the ashes.
That's true. Continuum is owned by Tim and Marcy Mondavi and Margaret Mondavi. Michael has his own company, Folio Wine Company, or Michael Mondavi Winery. But you're right, and Continuum is actually, I think, making better wines than Tim did at Mondavi. So,
yeah,
And
I would agree with that.
his kid, and it's a very small production winery, and it's all about, he's in the vineyard. He's the one, it's one winery that I know of, some years ago, that actually he controls it from the vineyard to the bottle himself with his family. And the kids are involved, they're doing sales and marketing, the girls are hospitality. It's a beautiful story how it ended up with his own personal family.
but we should also mention, since this is Women for WineSense, that Marcy Mondavi, Michael and Tim's sister, ended up with far more money out of the deal than anybody else did. The whole family got, hundreds of millions, but she ended up with more than anybody else did. I'm not sure how that happened.
Really?
Yeah, and she also told me once, "Why do you think I moved to New York to be away from all this family feuding?"
Yeah. No.
By the way, the other Mondavis, Peter Mondavi, who's turning 99 in November, and last time I saw him, it was a couple of weeks ago, he wears a hearing aid, but he's sharp as a tack, absolutely. And he climbs the stairs, goes to work every day and all that. And his two sons are very grounded, I think. And Charles Krug Winery is doing very well now. Peter Mondavi was actually a pioneer in a lot of things that people did not give him credit for. And they just sit there quietly, and they are spending a huge amount of money. They've invested in their vineyards and in their property, and we'll be having a grand opening and some of that in the fairly near future. Opus One ended up it's half owned by Constellation and half owned by the Rothschild. So basically, it took a while, and they had to decide, but they did agree to keep it. But it was not an absolute certain thing that the Baroness Philippine de Rothschild would actually let Constellation buy it.
You mean for the novel? No, I interviewed no one for the novel.
Some of them won't talk to you.
I made all that up.
Like Jim Laube. Jim Laube won't talk to the press for what it's worth, and he doesn't.
Well, I mean, I have met him. I know about his influence. One of the things about a novel is that you're not, I mean, I don't think a novel resonates unless it makes sense to the person reading, that it seems relevant and believable. But I think the best novels work on some level where they're not reflecting actual conversations or stories that people about people you know. The composite is sort of a crude way of doing it that I was talking about earlier, but mostly it just helps to know something about the subject and just to hang around for a long time. That's why usually often novels written about childhood or early adolescence or young adulthood are good because the person was there and it's that person's view. But you don't, I keep saying that this book is not to be taken literally. It's really a work of the imagination, and I just kind of went with where it took me. And I was describing earlier how it started, and it's true. I've said this before, that trying to write a novel is it's usually like falling in love with somebody who doesn't love you and never will. And you keep working at it, but it doesn't work, and then, finally you throw it away. But in this case, and I've done that. I've actually written the whole novels that weren't published. But this was different. It was like, and it's, it's a kind of a cliche because you've heard it before. Other writers have said it. But it's true. You sit down and you don't know what's going to happen. And then there's somebody behind you jerking the strings and the story comes out, So.
Are you schizophrenic? Is that how you have voices in your head?
I don't know if that's what's required.
I haven't read the book yet, but I will. And I did hear the interview on the radio, and I wondered about the prequel. So after I read this, what would I expect in a prequel? You had talked about maybe writing it.
Well, a funny thing happened with this book, and what this book knows with the novel. Clyde Craven-Jones runs into dark difficulties, and he ran into the dark difficulties earlier in the first version that I wrote. And my editor was smitten with him. Now, I don't know why, because he's not all that attractive. But anyway, she was. She said she wanted to see more of him. Why don't you have this, why don't you keep him around longer? So I thought, what a terrible idea, because that means work, But then I started doing it, and then I thought, she's absolutely right. So the book was better, and it kept him around. And then his widow and Les Breeden, the maverick journalist. Don't
give away stuff.
Sorry?
Don't give away stuff.
Okay. Well, that's all I'm telling you about that. But at any rate, I was struck by the fact that because this is I thought maybe that this was a woman closer to my age, but no, she's quite young. So I thought, well, she likes this guy. If she likes him at 300 pounds and 60 years old, she's going to go crazy for him at 30 and 180, good-looking Brit, So essentially, it's about Clyde Craven-Jones as a hunk who gets ditched by a woman in London, where he's made a name for himself, and he comes to a place like Sonoma, Napa, right after the Paris tasting in the late 70s, when things were really beginning to, or were already popping, and he falls in with some sisters who have inherited a moribund winery, and that's all I'm telling you.
6'4" or 6'5"?
Whatever.
And by the way, although I got in trouble with you for saying it was the Napa was a novelization, I will say that I found that it reads like a novel. I mean, just takes you forward. You can't put it down. So without anything, not comparing those in a bad way, I think that Napa is one of the most compelling books I've ever read. Not just because it's about a place that I love and I moved to, partly because of this stupid book, but
I beg your pardon.
I'm susceptible that way. I moved to the Caribbean to live on a sailboat after reading some books that I should have read too. But anyway.
Well, some people will remember Tom Wolfe claiming he invented the nonfiction novel. Do you remember that? And which was not Tom Wolfe, but to my mind, I was more interested in writing I like the fictional form because you can actually do it with nonfiction if you get enough material amassed and are willing to give up, not giving up, just sounding like an authority. And that's really what I wanted to do with Napa. And Napa, unfortunately, was that the book that was 850-page manuscript, and the sequel to it, The Far Side of Eden, I think is a better book. It doesn't have as much information in it, but it works better, and that definitely is constructed along fictional lines, but it is a work of nonfiction. This, however, has no constraints on it.
But it does help if you're a good writer. I mean, not everybody can write a book like Napa, or The Story of an American Eden, or The Far Side of Eden, or even Nose.
Well, thank you, Paul.
Any other questions? Chris, what's the timing? Oh.
I would say one more.
Okay, one more.
I'm curious. You refer to Clyde. You like Clyde. What's your sense in terms of what the Clydes of the wine world have done to the industry? At the end of the day, is it positive?
No, that's a very good question. Paul would know more about this than I, but the Clyde Craven-Jones has his own point system, and he has his own wine letter. He gets rich and very influential because of this, and also because he's good at what he does. Now we're having, the people with the wine by the numbers. Parker's the most obvious. Well, the Spectator and Parker. Parker's had all these problems recently, which you will probably know about, and Wine Spectator still steaming along. But there's a big debate now about what the future of wine criticism is and how people are going to buy wine. And there's been a lot of criticism of the 100-point system. I'm not a professional, and there are professionals here in this room, and they're for a while it seemed to me the talk was it was going to go down. Now it's not going down, and the Wine Spectator seems to have risen. But somebody I talked to recently about this said that people who buy wine by the numbers are sort of the legacy buyers. In other words, people my age. The younger people, the 30s, are not so. Even wealthy people who can afford $100, $200 Cabernets are not as interested in that. They care about origins, about not just where the grapes come from, how the land's treated, the people, the whole schmear. They're also not necessarily going to be limited by the almighty duo of Cabernet and Chardonnay. That for years, that was sort of, and in Napa, these great big fruit-forward alcoholic wines, there's a lot riding on the continued success of that. A lot of people who make those are not adaptable. They're not, and if this ever takes off, and where, younger people really they're much more adventurous. In my observation, they're much more adventurous in what they drink, and that could, down the line, have an effect. But as somebody pointed out, the numbers are always going to help people. There are always going to be people who, with the money, who need to be able to buy a wine for a gift or for a special occasion, and they don't have time to go research it. But Googling wines has become hugely influential because you can't get a Google, as far as I know, you can't get a rating from the Wine Spectator or the Wine Advocate if you Google it. They're not, unless somebody else has posted it, but you can't count on getting. Whereas A lot of people just go now to the latest thing that's been written about whatever the wine is, and that's how they make their decision. How this all shakes out, I have no idea. But
I do think that personal recommendations of people you respect, some of them critics, but also your friends, have a huge impact. I used to give ratings to wine, and I stopped after I do a lot of reporting about technical wine subjects, and I've discovered that a lot of winemakers have very different tastes. Some of them cannot taste or smell TCA or Brettanomyces, amazingly enough. Others have tremendous tolerance for tannins and all. And so I stopped doing that, and that's one reason I don't write for some of those publications anymore. But because of that, somebody said it over here, you find someone like Wilfred Wong, or I happen to, Jancis Robinson and Dan Berger, when they like a wine, I probably like it. If Jim Laube or Robert Parker likes a wine, I'll probably like it in 5 years or 10 years, with food. So you learn if you're smart. And that doesn't mean the wine's bad or anything. It's a different style of wine. And so I take all that with a grain of salt. But the number that really matters to a lot of people is the cost. I mean, there are a lot of people who are most influenced by how much the wine costs. When Screaming Eagle raised the price to $7.50, Bill Harlan raised his price to $7.50. And Bob Mondavi once said to me, I think my wine should be the most expensive wine there is. Look what I've done for the industry. And so there's this attitude that you want to show off for your friends. That's the way to do it. Anyway, thank you. Jim, you want to?
yeah. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Great being here. Hope you like the book.
Okay, now this is my favorite part. This is a photo opportunity, please, just for me. Not for you guys, but for me. Oh, yay, how cool is this? Anyway, this is where we really treat like important celebrity-type people with total admiration. But I do want to make a commercial announcement first for Nose, because I have to tell you, I've been trying to read Nose. I bought the book when I first met you about 2 months ago, and I was so overloaded with work, and I would try and read it before I went to sleep. Well, that doesn't work because, you have like the brain cell of a fly at that point. So I realized that when I went up to the Wine Bloggers Conference, and there's a few folks here from the Wine Bloggers Conference, once I had more than 10 minutes of focused attention, I could not put this book down. It took me approximately 3 hours to finish the rest of it, where I was struggling for about 6 hours prior to that because I was being a doofus. Anyway, you'll love it. It's a great romp.